2025 was a year marked by political shifts, international crises, and mounting global challenges. Governments collapsed, protests filled the streets, wars dragged on, and unexpected events shocked millions. From Washington to Paris, from global summits to sudden crises, these moments didn't just make headlines, they changed the direction of global politics. Economic uncertainty, social unrest, and environmental disasters all converged to make 2025 a year that tested the resilience of nations worldwide. January began with a major political transition in the United States. A new presidential administration took office, signaling changes in both domestic and foreign policy. Early executive orders on trade, defense, and energy policy immediately drew attention, influencing global markets and prompting cautious reactions from allies and adversaries alike. Congressional negotiations over the federal budget began amid growing public concern about inflation and cost of living pressures. Meanwhile, the conflict in Ukraine continued into 2025, keeping Europe on the high alert. Reports emerged of intensified fighting along key front lines in eastern Ukraine, while diplomatic channels in Brussels and Washington scrambled to secure renewed military aid and support for peace negotiations. The ongoing war strained European economies and reinforced the urgency of NATO's strategic planning for regional security. In Asia, China announced new economic and industrial policies aimed at boosting domestic manufacturing while tightening regulations on foreign investment. The moves raised concerns among global trade partners about potential supply chain disruptions and the broader stability of global markets. Additionally, tensions in the Taiwan Strait remained high, as Chinese military exercises near the island prompted regional governments and the United States to issue strong statements on security and deterrence. Over in Europe, Vatican City marked the beginning of the Catholic Jubilee Year, an event that drew millions of pilgrims from around the world. Beyond its religious significance, the Jubilee Year served as a platform for global diplomacy, with church leaders meeting heads of state to discuss humanitarian initiatives, peace-building efforts, and international cooperation. Globally, early climate disasters struck multiple regions. Severe winter storms hit Europe, displacing thousands and causing widespread infrastructure damage. In Southeast Asia, flooding affected millions, prompting emergency evacuations in countries such as Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. At the same time, wildfires in North America and Siberia intensified, creating humanitarian and environmental crises that captured international attention. These events highlighted the growing intersection of climate, politics, and economics, forcing governments to respond rapidly to both immediate disasters and long-term adaptation needs. Additionally, social movements began gaining momentum in various regions. Youth-led protests in countries including Nepal, Tunisia, and parts of Latin America demanded reforms in governance, transparency, and social justice, signaling a rising global demand for accountability and political inclusion. Meanwhile, major economic institutions, including the IMF and World Bank, issued early-year warnings about the potential for global recession if rising inflation, trade tensions, and environmental crises were not addressed promptly. Investors closely monitored commodity prices, particularly energy and agricultural markets, as disruptions in supply chains and climate impacts threatened economic stability. Even in the realm of culture and sports, unexpected events shaped global discourse. For example, international film festivals and sporting events faced cancellations or emergency adjustments due to weather crises and political unrest, highlighting the far-reaching effects of instability on everyday life and international cooperation. January 2025, in short, set the tone for a year in which political transitions, ongoing conflicts, climate disasters, social unrest, and economic uncertainty would intersect. A year where the stakes for global stability had never felt higher. February 2025 was a month defined by rising global tensions, social unrest, and economic uncertainty. As winter continued across the Northern Hemisphere, political leaders grappled with the early-year crises and prepared for a year of high-stakes diplomacy. In Germany, the Munich Security Conference convened, bringing together heads of state, defense ministers, and global security experts. The conference focused on rising geopolitical instability, including the war in Ukraine, escalating tensions in the Asia-Pacific, and emerging cyber threats. NATO representatives emphasized the need for coordinated defense spending and modernization, while analysts debated Europe's long-term security strategy amid uncertain U.S. commitments. Meanwhile, in Nepal, youth-led protests intensified, spreading to multiple cities and towns. Demonstrators demanded greater transparency, action against corruption, and political reforms. What began as localized rallies quickly evolved into nationwide demonstrations, disrupting government operations and forcing the prime minister to engage in high-level negotiations with opposition parties. The movement drew international attention, highlighting the global trend of youth activism challenging entrenched political structures. Across the Middle East, diplomatic efforts to stabilize regional conflicts faced setbacks. In Syria and Yemen, intermittent ceasefires failed to hold, prompting renewed humanitarian crises. In Iran, domestic protests over economic hardships and fuel shortages added pressure on the government, while Gulf states attempted quiet diplomacy to ease tensions in the region. These developments kept Middle Eastern stability at the forefront of global security discussions. In the United States, economic concerns dominated the political discourse. Inflation remained a pressing issue, affecting everyday costs for households across the nation. The federal government faced mounting pressure to provide relief measures, while debates intensified over interest rates, monetary policy, and the potential consequences for the broader economy. Public dissatisfaction over the cost of living influenced both legislative negotiations and media coverage, creating a politically charged environment. Globally, trade tensions resurfaced as major economies edged toward reciprocal tariffs on key commodities. The dispute between the U.S. and China over technology exports and rare earth materials escalated, prompting warnings from the World Trade Organization about possible global economic slowdown. Analysts emphasize that even minor policy shifts in these two economies could ripple across emerging markets, disrupting supply chains and investment flows. Meanwhile, environmental crises continued to make headlines. Severe floods in South Asia displaced hundreds of thousands, while unusually warm winter temperatures in parts of Europe caused early snowmelt, leading to river flooding and infrastructure challenges. Governments began coordinating international relief efforts, and climate policy discussions gained momentum, with calls for faster action from both public and private sectors. February also saw a number of unexpected geopolitical flashpoints. In Latin America, political unrest in Chile and Peru challenged governments already grappling with economic inequality and social demands. In Africa, escalating border tensions between Ethiopia and Sudan drew international concern, prompting emergency discussions at the African Union. On the technological front, major conferences in Europe highlighted the rising importance of artificial intelligence and cybersecurity in national security planning. Countries including Germany, France, and the UK began drafting legislation to regulate emerging technologies, balancing innovation with the need for public safety and ethical standards. In sum, February 2025 reflected a world navigating multiple pressures simultaneously: security threats, economic volatility, social unrest, and environmental emergencies. Governments faced mounting expectations from citizens and international partners alike, all while preparing for the complex challenges that the remainder of the year would bring. March 2025 was a month marked by escalating conflicts, rising geopolitical tension, and growing economic uncertainty. As winter thawed into spring in the Northern Hemisphere, governments worldwide faced mounting pressures from persistent wars, regional flashpoints, and shifting alliances. In the United Kingdom, international diplomacy focused heavily on Ukraine and Europe's long-term security. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak hosted a series of high-level meetings with European leaders and NATO officials, centered on strengthening military commitments and ensuring alliance unity. These talks underscored the ongoing challenge of balancing support for Ukraine with broader European security interests, including energy and defense coordination. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine continued to dominate global headlines. Russian forces maintained pressure on eastern and southern front lines, while Ukraine responded with intensified counteroffensives. Both sides reported heavy losses, and civilian populations faced ongoing humanitarian crises. Internationally, debates raged over the type and level of military aid provided to Kyiv, with the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom playing key roles in shaping foreign support. At the same time, Russia faced increasing diplomatic isolation as Western sanctions tightened, targeting energy exports, financial systems, and elite individuals. Along the Israel-Lebanon border, tensions flared as sporadic clashes between Hezbollah forces and the Israeli Defense Forces threatened to escalate into a broader conflict. Regional powers, including the United States and France, issued warnings and called for restraint, while the United Nations dispatched envoys to mediate talks aimed at de-escalating the situation. In Africa, political instability intensified in multiple countries. In Sudan, clashes between military factions and rebel groups disrupted civilian life, prompting intervention by African Union mediators. In Nigeria, continued attacks by extremist groups in the northeast exacerbated the humanitarian situation, while in Tunisia and Morocco, protests over economic inequality and unemployment signaled rising domestic discontent. International organizations closely monitored these developments, concerned about regional spillover effects. Globally, economic uncertainty deepened. Trade conflicts that had emerged in February continued to expand, particularly between the United States, China, and the European Union. Rising commodity prices, disruptions in supply chains, and fluctuating currency markets contributed to fears of a slowing global economy. Analysts warned that prolonged geopolitical crises could have cascading effects, potentially pushing developing nations into deeper financial distress. In Asia, tensions between China and Taiwan remained a focus for the international community. Chinese military exercises near Taiwan intensified, prompting regional allies to conduct joint drills in response. Japan and South Korea increased maritime patrols, while the United States reaffirmed its commitment to regional security, signaling ongoing strategic rivalry. March also saw significant developments in climate and humanitarian crises. Flooding in Southeast Asia displaced millions, particularly in the Philippines and Indonesia, while drought conditions in East Africa threatened food security for millions of people. Global relief agencies, including the United Nations and the Red Cross, called for increased international assistance to mitigate the human cost of these disasters. Social movements continued to gain prominence. Protests in Nepal and Latin America highlighted rising youth engagement in politics as citizens demanded transparency, accountability, and reform. In Europe, demonstrations over rising energy prices and cost of living pressures signaled growing frustration with political leadership. Meanwhile, international summits and policy dialogues addressed new threats. In Geneva, security experts convened to discuss cyber warfare and artificial intelligence in national defense strategies, while environmental ministers met in Brussels to plan for upcoming climate summits. These discussions highlighted the interconnection of technology, security, and climate as defining challenges for the global community. By the end of March 2025, the world faced a complex tapestry of political, economic, and social pressures. Ongoing wars, fragile alliances, domestic unrest, and environmental emergencies combined to make clear that 2025 would be a year of high-stakes diplomacy, unpredictable outcomes, and transformative global change. April 2025 was a month of contrasts, showcasing both global collaboration and rising tensions across multiple regions. As spring unfolded in the Northern Hemisphere, international attention was drawn to innovation, security challenges, and political gridlocks that would shape the year ahead. In Japan, the World Expo 2025 opened in Osaka, bringing together nations to showcase innovation in technology, renewable energy, and sustainable development. Delegations from over 100 countries participated, highlighting breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, transportation, and medical research. The expo was widely seen as a symbol of global cooperation during a year marked by conflict and uncertainty, while discussions on climate resilience and sustainable cities dominated the conference halls. Meanwhile, in the United States, political divisions deepened as budget negotiations in Congress stalled. Disagreements over funding priorities, social programs, and defense spending led to early warnings of a potential government shutdown. Public concern over the deadlock intensified, with media coverage emphasizing the impact on federal employees, social services, and national confidence in governance. Tensions between China and Taiwan continued to escalate. Military maneuvers and signaling in the Taiwan Strait heightened regional anxiety. The United States, Japan, and Australia expressed concern over potential miscalculations, while diplomatic channels worked behind the scenes to de-escalate the situation. Analysts warned that even small incidents could have far-reaching geopolitical consequences given the complex network of alliances and economic interdependencies in the region. Across Europe, migration pressures became a central political issue. Countries along the Mediterranean, including Italy, Spain, and Greece, reported increasing arrivals of migrants fleeing conflict and climate disasters. This inflow intensified debates over asylum policy, border security, and integration, while populist political parties leveraged the issue to gain public support. The European Union struggled to coordinate a unified response, highlighting the fragility of regional consensus on humanitarian matters. Globally, climate talks intensified ahead of upcoming international summits. Extreme weather events, including severe floods in South America and early-season heat waves in Africa, emphasized the urgent need for coordinated action. Governments faced mounting pressure to implement both mitigation strategies and disaster relief programs as public awareness of climate risk grew. In the Middle East, diplomatic efforts to stabilize ongoing conflicts continued, though progress remained slow. Negotiations over ceasefires and humanitarian corridors in Syria, Yemen, and Gaza were ongoing, with international organizations monitoring the situation closely. In Iran, domestic economic protests persisted, reflecting frustration over inflation, unemployment, and energy shortages. Economic concerns were also prominent. Global markets reacted to inflation trends, commodity fluctuations, and supply chain challenges, particularly in energy and agricultural sectors. Analysts warned that unresolved trade tensions between major economies could further destabilize markets, affecting both developed and emerging nations. Meanwhile, social movements gained traction worldwide. In several countries across Latin America, Asia, and Europe, protests focused on corruption, social inequality, and demands for political accountability. Youth-led demonstrations in Nepal and South America reflected a growing trend of civic engagement and public activism, signaling a generational demand for more responsive governance. April also saw increased attention to technological and cybersecurity risks. Conferences in Berlin and London emphasized the need for robust AI governance and stronger cybersecurity infrastructure, as governments and multinational corporations grappled with the implications of rapid digital transformation. By the end of April 2025, the world faced a delicate balance. Moments of international cooperation, as seen at World Expo 2025, contrasted sharply with political deadlocks, escalating regional tensions, and growing social unrest. The month underscored the complexity of global governance in a year where innovation, security, and human resilience were all being tested simultaneously. May 2025 was a month of historic leadership transitions, political tests, and growing global concerns over basic human needs. Across continents, governments and populations faced challenges ranging from diplomatic negotiations to economic pressures and social unrest. In Vatican City, the world witnessed a major moment in global religious leadership: the papal transition. Pope Francis officially stepped down, and a new pontiff was elected in a process closely watched by millions around the world. Beyond its spiritual significance, the change carried substantial cultural and political weight. Vatican diplomats began engaging immediately with heads of state, emphasizing humanitarian aid, climate action, and peace initiatives, underscoring the Vatican's continued influence in international diplomacy. Across Europe, the European Union faced political tests as elections in multiple member states revealed deepening internal divisions. Populist and nationalist parties gained ground in countries like Italy, Spain, and Hungary, challenging the cohesion of the bloc. Debates over fiscal policy, energy strategy, and migration highlighted tensions between long-standing EU frameworks and emerging domestic priorities. Brussels worked to maintain unity, but analysts warned that the coming months would test Europe's resilience in the face of both internal and external pressures. In the Middle East, diplomatic efforts aimed at preventing further escalation of regional conflicts continued, but progress remained fragile. In Syria, ceasefires were intermittently respected, while in Yemen, humanitarian corridors struggled to reach those in need. Israel and Gaza saw ongoing negotiations over ceasefire agreements, though sporadic violence reminded the world of the delicate balance in the region. Across Africa, national elections highlighted the challenges of democracy and governance. In countries such as Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, elections were closely contested, revealing persistent concerns over voter suppression, political corruption, and security risks. At the same time, extremist groups continued to operate in parts of the Sahel and Horn of Africa, prompting regional and international security responses. Globally, food security became an increasingly urgent political issue. Rising prices for staples such as wheat, rice, and maize affected millions, particularly in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. Poor harvests, supply chain disruptions, and climate-related disasters compounded the crisis, forcing governments to implement emergency measures and international organizations to coordinate relief efforts. Analysts warned that food shortages could exacerbate social unrest and migration pressures, with political consequences for both domestic and international stability. In Asia, tensions persisted between China and neighboring countries over trade, territorial disputes, and military posturing. China's economic slowdown, coupled with new industrial policies, raised concerns about the ripple effects on global markets. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts in the Asia-Pacific sought to reinforce regional security and manage competition between major powers. Social movements continued to shape the global landscape. Protests driven by youth and civil society organizations gained momentum in Latin America, Asia, and Europe, demanding political accountability, anti-corruption measures, and social reforms. These movements reflected a broader trend of citizen activism influencing government policy and public discourse worldwide. Economically, global markets remained on edge. Volatility in commodities, fluctuations in energy prices, and uncertainty in trade relations kept governments and investors vigilant. International financial institutions warned that without coordinated fiscal and monetary strategies, economic instability could intensify throughout the rest of 2025. May 2025, in summary, highlighted the interconnected nature of global politics. Leadership changes in the Vatican, elections across Europe and Africa, regional conflicts in the Middle East, and urgent food security challenges illustrated how political, social, and environmental pressures were increasingly intertwined. As the month closed, it became clear that the world was navigating a complex and fragile global order, with diplomacy, governance, and resilience all in high demand. June 2025 was a month that highlighted the growing disconnect between governments and citizens, the urgency of international security discussions, and the escalating impact of climate change worldwide. Across continents, political tensions, public unrest, and environmental crises combined to create a volatile global atmosphere. In the United States, widespread demonstrations known as No King's Day protests erupted across major cities. These protests reflected deep political division, frustration with government leadership, and growing distrust in institutions. Citizens from diverse backgrounds took to the streets to demand accountability, transparency, and reforms to democratic processes. Law enforcement agencies struggled to manage large-scale demonstrations, and media coverage emphasized both the intensity of public anger and the potential implications for upcoming elections. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, NATO leaders convened for a high-profile meeting focused on defense spending, alliance strategy, and emerging security threats. Discussions emphasized the need for modernization of military capabilities, coordination of cyber defense, and preparation for potential escalation in regions of conflict, including Eastern Europe and the Asia-Pacific. Analysts noted that the meeting reflected growing concern over Russia's continued military posture, tensions in the Taiwan Strait, and uncertainty regarding U.S. engagement in global security affairs. Across the world, extreme heat and climate emergencies intensified as summer began. Regions in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa experienced record-breaking temperatures, prompting warnings from meteorological agencies and governments alike. Wildfires erupted across the western United States, southern Europe, and parts of Russia, forcing mass evacuations and putting immense pressure on firefighting and emergency response resources. In South Asia, heat waves exacerbated water shortages and agricultural stress, raising concerns over food security. Governments faced mounting pressure to implement both immediate relief measures and long-term climate adaptation policies. In the Asia-Pacific, security concerns dominated diplomatic discussions. Rising tensions between China and Taiwan, territorial disputes in the South China Sea, and North Korea's missile tests prompted coordinated diplomatic responses. Regional powers, including Japan, South Korea, and Australia, increased military readiness, while engaging in high-level dialogue with the United States to manage the risk of escalation. Analysts highlighted the growing complexity of balancing deterrence, diplomacy, and economic interdependence in a strategically sensitive region. Globally, mass protests became a defining political trend. From Latin America to Europe and parts of Africa and Asia, citizens mobilized around issues such as corruption, climate inaction, economic inequality, and democratic reforms. Social movements increasingly leveraged digital platforms to organize, amplifying public demands for transparency and responsiveness. Governments struggled to respond, often facing both domestic criticism and international scrutiny. In Africa, ongoing security operations targeted extremist groups across the Sahel and Horn of Africa. Military campaigns and counterterrorism initiatives were complemented by international humanitarian support, yet instability remained a persistent challenge. The growing number of displaced persons and refugees from conflict zones added additional political and social pressures on neighboring countries. Economically, global markets responded to a combination of political unrest, climate disasters, and trade uncertainties. Energy prices fluctuated sharply due to heatwave-related demand spikes, while agricultural markets were disrupted by both drought and flooding in different regions. Analysts warned that continued instability could have cascading effects, particularly for developing nations reliant on imports for food and energy. By the end of June 2025, the world faced a stark reality. Public dissatisfaction, regional insecurity, and climate emergencies were converging in ways that required urgent attention from governments and international organizations alike. The month illustrated that political stability, economic resilience, and environmental preparedness were increasingly inseparable, and that the events of mid-2025 would have lasting implications for both national and global governance. July 2025 was a month that underscored the growing tensions between citizens and governments, the shifting balance of global power, and the challenges posed by emerging technologies. Across continents, public unrest, high-profile summits, and debates over regulation shaped the headlines. In the United States, Independence Day protests once again highlighted deep political polarization. Demonstrations erupted in major cities, fueled by dissatisfaction over government policies, social inequality, and perceived erosion of democratic norms. The protests reflected the broader trend of civic activism seen throughout the year, signaling that public engagement and public frustration would remain a defining feature of U.S. politics. Analysts noted that these demonstrations could influence upcoming elections and reshape national discourse on governance and civil rights. In Brazil, the BRICS summit brought together leaders from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with the aim of strengthening cooperation among emerging global powers. Discussions focused on trade, investment, and multilateral coordination, highlighting the shifting influence of non-Western nations in global affairs. The summit also underscored growing efforts by BRICS countries to create alternative financial and technological infrastructures that challenge traditional Western-dominated systems. Observers noted that the meeting reflected both ambition and the complexities of aligning diverse political and economic agendas. At the United Nations, diplomatic talks on the Middle East continued, though progress remained slow. Negotiators addressed fragile ceasefires in Syria, Yemen, and Gaza, working to prevent escalation while coordinating humanitarian aid. While agreements were tentative, the ongoing dialogue demonstrated persistent international commitment to managing regional instability, even amid competing geopolitical interests. Across Europe, economic uncertainty fueled political instability. Rising energy prices, inflation, and public dissatisfaction put pressure on governments, particularly in southern and eastern Europe. Demonstrations over living costs emerged in cities across Spain, Italy, and Greece, highlighting the social consequences of economic strain. Analysts warned that failure to address these issues could weaken public trust in institutions and exacerbate political polarization. Globally, artificial intelligence regulation emerged as a major geopolitical issue. Governments debated how to govern rapidly advancing AI technologies, weighing potential benefits against risks to privacy, security, and labor markets. In Europe, regulatory proposals aimed to standardize AI safety and ethics, while the United States and China engaged in strategic discussions about innovation, competition, and military applications. The issue became central to broader discussions about technology, sovereignty, and global governance. In the Asia-Pacific, security and economic concerns remained intertwined. Rising tensions between China and Taiwan, along with ongoing territorial disputes in the South China Sea, prompted diplomatic and military maneuvering. At the same time, regional trade and investment agreements sought to balance economic growth with security imperatives, highlighting the intricate web of cooperation and competition in the region. Climate-related events continued to impact communities worldwide. Heat waves, wildfires, and storms strained emergency services in North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, emphasizing the urgent need for coordinated global climate action. Governments faced growing pressure from citizens and international organizations to implement policies addressing both immediate disaster response and long-term climate resilience. Social movements across the globe continued to influence political landscapes. From Latin America to Africa, protests focused on corruption, inequality, and democratic reform. Youth-led activism in particular was increasingly visible, demonstrating the rising influence of younger generations in shaping national and international political agendas. By the end of July 2025, the global stage was defined by a complex mix of civic unrest, diplomatic negotiation, economic volatility, and technological debate. The month illustrated that governance in 2025 required not only domestic management, but also skillful navigation of international challenges, from climate crises to emerging technological frontiers, and from shifting global alliances to the persistent demand for accountability from citizens worldwide. August 2025 was a month marked by intensifying climate disasters, economic uncertainty, and ongoing geopolitical challenges. Across the globe, governments were forced to respond to simultaneous crises, from natural disasters to protracted conflicts, highlighting the increasingly interconnected nature of international politics. Across continents, heat waves, floods, and storms dominated headlines. Record-breaking temperatures in North America, Europe, and Asia strained energy grids and public health systems, while flooding in Southeast Asia displaced millions of residents. In Africa, seasonal rains triggered landslides in multiple countries, compounding food security concerns already exacerbated by drought conditions in the Sahel region. Emergency response agencies, both domestic and international, struggled to meet growing humanitarian needs, while citizens demanded more proactive climate policies. In China, economic slowdown became a major concern for both domestic and international observers. Slower industrial output, declining exports, and cautious consumer spending raised fears of ripple effects across global supply chains. Beijing introduced stimulus measures aimed at stabilizing growth, but analysts warned that structural economic challenges, including high debt levels and regional disparities, would make recovery gradual. International markets closely monitored the situation, as investor confidence wavered in response to both economic indicators and geopolitical uncertainties. Across Africa, security operations targeted extremist groups, particularly in the Sahel and parts of East Africa. Governments coordinated with regional organizations and international partners to address terrorism, human trafficking, and cross-border insurgencies. Despite these efforts, widespread instability remained a pressing concern, impacting political processes, trade, and humanitarian aid delivery. In Ukraine, war fatigue began to shape international policy discussions. Allies debated long-term support strategies, balancing military aid with domestic economic pressures. Civilians in conflict zones continued to face severe hardships, and global attention shifted toward humanitarian relief, reconstruction planning, and efforts to prevent escalation. Russia's continued military actions, coupled with sanctions and diplomatic isolation, kept Eastern Europe on edge. Globally, migration pressures increased as conflicts, climate disasters, and economic crises displaced millions. Countries in Europe, North America, and Asia faced growing challenges in managing arrivals, integrating refugees, and responding to public concern over border security. International organizations called for coordinated action to address both immediate humanitarian needs and long-term migration policies. Economic volatility remained a key issue. Commodity prices fluctuated in response to both climate events and geopolitical tensions, affecting energy, agriculture, and manufacturing sectors. Trade disputes between major powers, particularly between the United States and China, added further uncertainty, prompting warnings from international financial institutions about potential global economic slowdown. Social movements and protests continued to make headlines. In Latin America, citizens mobilized around issues of corruption, inequality, and climate policy, while in parts of Asia, demonstrations highlighted growing dissatisfaction with governance and economic management. Analysts noted that public unrest in 2025 was increasingly transnational in nature, driven by both local grievances and global awareness of interconnected challenges. In summary, August 2025 revealed a world grappling with multiple simultaneous crises. Climate disasters, economic slowdown, regional insecurity, and rising migration pressures underscored the urgent need for coordinated domestic and international action. The month illustrated that political leadership in 2025 required not only immediate crisis management, but also long-term planning to address the structural challenges shaping the global order. September 2025 was a month defined by political upheaval, diplomatic engagement, and pressing economic and environmental concerns. Across the globe, leaders faced mounting pressure to respond to social unrest, regional conflicts, and shifting international expectations. In Nepal, months of sustained protests culminated in a historic moment. The prime minister resigned, signaling a major political turning point. Youth-led demonstrations, initially sparked by frustration over corruption and weak governance, had grown into a nationwide movement demanding accountability and reform. Political analysts noted that Nepal's transition could influence democratic engagement across South Asia, as citizens increasingly expect responsive governance and transparency. In the United States, world leaders gathered for the UN General Assembly in New York, focusing on global reform, security, and climate action. Discussions emphasized the need for stronger international cooperation on emerging threats, from conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East to cyber warfare and artificial intelligence governance. U.S. diplomats reinforced commitments to alliances while addressing domestic criticism over economic pressures and ongoing public dissatisfaction. Across the Middle East, fragile ceasefires faced renewed strain. Violence in Gaza, Syria, and Yemen threatened diplomatic progress, while international organizations worked to maintain humanitarian access. Regional powers engaged in high-level talks, emphasizing conflict resolution and stabilization, but the risk of renewed escalation remained high. Analysts highlighted the enduring complexity of balancing humanitarian priorities with strategic interests in a volatile region. In Europe, energy policy returned to the forefront of political debate ahead of winter. Rising gas and electricity costs, combined with uncertainties in supply from Russia and North Africa, prompted governments to develop contingency plans and accelerate investment in renewable energy. Public concern over affordability and energy security shaped political discourse, while opposition parties leveraged the issue to challenge incumbents. Analysts warned that energy stability would remain a decisive factor in European politics for the coming months. Globally, calls for reform of international institutions grew louder. Citizens, advocacy groups, and even some governments questioned whether current structures, from the UN to global trade organizations, could effectively address modern crises such as climate change, economic inequality, and cyber threats. Debates over representation, accountability, and responsiveness intensified, reflecting a broader desire for modernization of international governance. In Africa, ongoing political transitions and security challenges continued to draw attention. Elections in several countries highlighted the difficulties of consolidating democracy amid social unrest and extremist threats. Governments face pressure to deliver both stability and development, while regional organizations coordinated efforts to strengthen governance and promote peace. Economically, global markets responded to a mix of uncertainty and geopolitical risk. Commodity prices fluctuated, trade tensions persisted, and financial institutions issued warnings about potential slowdowns. Analysts emphasized the interconnected nature of global economics, noting that events in one region could ripple across continents, affecting energy, food security, and investment flows. Environmental and climate issues also remained in focus. Early season storms in parts of Asia, heat waves in Europe, and floods in Africa underscored the urgency of climate resilience planning. Governments faced increasing pressure to implement both immediate disaster relief measures and long-term adaptation strategies, as public awareness of climate risks continued to grow. By the end of September 2025, the world was navigating a complex web of political transitions, diplomatic negotiations, and economic pressures. From Nepal's leadership change to global debates at the UN, and from Middle East ceasefire challenges to European energy concerns, the month highlighted the delicate balance leaders must maintain in a rapidly evolving international landscape. The events of September reaffirmed that governance in 2025 required agility, foresight, and an unprecedented level of global coordination. October 2025 was a month defined by sudden security shocks, renewed armed conflict, and a deepening sense of public unease across much of the world. As autumn progressed in the Northern Hemisphere, governments were forced to confront both unexpected crises and long-simmering tensions. In France, a major heist at the Louvre Museum shocked the global public. The theft, carried out despite advanced security systems, raised serious questions about the protection of cultural heritage sites. French authorities launched a large-scale investigation, while political leaders faced criticism over security preparedness. Across Europe, governments moved quickly to reassess protections at museums, landmarks, and cultural institutions, fearing similar incidents. The event became a symbol of broader concerns about security vulnerabilities in public spaces. Across the wider European continent, the response was swift. Several countries increased police presence at major tourist attractions, transportation hubs, and public venues. Emergency security meetings were held in Brussels and Paris, as officials debated whether existing counterterrorism and crime prevention strategies were sufficient in an era of increasingly complex threats. The incident fueled public debate about surveillance, civil liberties, and the balance between security and freedom. In the Middle East, renewed fighting between Israel and Gaza dominated international headlines. Airstrikes, rocket fire, and ground operations intensified, while diplomatic efforts sought to revive ceasefire talks. Civilian casualties and humanitarian concerns drew widespread international attention, prompting urgent calls for restraint from the United Nations and regional powers. Aid agencies warned of worsening conditions on the ground, as access to food, water, and medical supplies became increasingly limited. At the same time, ceasefire negotiations continued behind closed doors, involving regional mediators and global powers. While brief pauses in fighting were reported, the situation remained volatile, highlighting the fragility of diplomatic progress in one of the world's most persistent conflict zones. In Asia, large-scale military exercises conducted by several regional powers raised tensions. Naval and Air Force drills in East Asia and the Western Pacific prompted concern among neighboring countries, who responded with increased surveillance and readiness. Analysts warned that while such exercises were often framed as defensive, the risk of miscalculation was growing in an already tense strategic environment. Globally, economic uncertainty continued to fuel public unrest. Rising living costs, housing shortages, and job insecurity triggered protests in multiple countries, including parts of Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Demonstrators called for stronger social protections, wage increases, and economic reforms. Governments struggled to respond, constrained by budget pressures and political divisions. Climate-related concerns also remained prominent. Severe autumn storms affected parts of southern Europe and East Asia, while prolonged drought conditions continued in regions of Africa and the Middle East. These events further strained public infrastructure and reinforced the political urgency of climate adaptation and disaster preparedness. In international diplomacy, October saw renewed debate over the effectiveness of global institutions. Leaders and commentators questioned whether existing frameworks were capable of responding to simultaneous crises, from war and climate change to economic instability and technological disruption. Calls for reform grew louder, particularly from developing nations seeking greater representation and influence. By the end of October 2025, the global atmosphere was marked by uncertainty and tension. A single security incident in Paris had rippled across continents. Renewed conflict in the Middle East threatened regional stability, and public frustration continued to rise worldwide. The month underscored how quickly isolated events could escalate into broader political challenges, and how fragile global stability had become in an increasingly interconnected world.
November 2025 was shaped by high-level diplomacy, worsening humanitarian crises, and mounting political pressure in several major economies. As the year approached its final stretch, global leaders faced difficult questions about equity, governance, and the future of international cooperation. In South Africa, the G20 summit was held on African soil for the first time, marking a significant symbolic and political moment. Leaders from the world's largest economies gathered to address global development, debt relief, climate finance, and economic inequality. African nations used the platform to push for greater representation in global financial institutions and fairer access to development funding. While the summit produced commitments on infrastructure investment and climate adaptation, critics questioned whether wealthier nations would follow through on their promises. Across the Middle East, diplomatic efforts continued amid worsening humanitarian conditions. In Gaza, Yemen, and parts of Syria, aid agencies warned of critical shortages of food, medicine, and clean water. International pressure increased on regional and global powers to facilitate humanitarian access and support ceasefire negotiations. Despite ongoing talks, violence and instability continued to undermine progress, reinforcing concerns about long-term regional security. In the United States, political tensions escalated as budget negotiations stalled further in Congress. Lawmakers remained divided over spending priorities, social programs, and defense funding. With deadlines approaching, fears of a government shutdown intensified, raising concerns about disruptions to public services and economic confidence. The standoff highlighted deep partisan divisions and fueled public frustration with political leadership. Globally, climate finance emerged as a major political battleground. Developing nations demanded increased financial support to adapt to climate change and recover from climate-related disasters. Wealthier countries faced growing pressure to meet funding commitments made in previous international agreements. Debates over responsibility, fairness, and accountability dominated climate forums, reflecting broader tensions between developed and developing economies. Relations between China and the United States continued to shape global politics. Strategic rivalry influenced diplomacy, trade discussions, and security planning across multiple regions. While both sides emphasized the need for dialogue to avoid escalation, disagreements over technology, military posture, and economic policy remained unresolved. Smaller nations increasingly found themselves navigating between competing spheres of influence. In Europe, governments faced renewed economic strain as inflation, energy costs, and public dissatisfaction persisted. Protests over living expenses and social services continued in several countries, while political leaders struggled to balance fiscal responsibility with demands for economic relief. Analysts warned that prolonged economic pressure could further destabilize domestic politics across the continent. In Asia-Pacific, security concerns remained prominent. Military coordination among allies increased, while diplomatic efforts aimed to reduce the risk of miscalculation in contested regions. Economic uncertainty, particularly related to global trade and supply chains, added another layer of complexity to regional decision-making. By the end of November 2025, the global picture was one of cautious diplomacy under strain. Major summits underscored the need for cooperation, yet unresolved conflicts, budget crises, and strategic rivalries continued to test the international system. As leaders looked toward the final month of the year, it became clear that many of the challenges defining 2025 would carry forward, shaping both policy decisions and global stability well beyond the calendar year. December 2025 brought the year to a close with unresolved crises, political disruption, and sobering reflections on the state of the world. Rather than offering relief, the final month underscored how many of the year's defining challenges remained unsettled. In the United States, a federal government shutdown disrupted public services after lawmakers failed to reach a budget agreement. Thousands of federal workers were furloughed, government agencies suspended operations, and economic confidence was shaken both domestically and abroad. International partners watched closely, concerned about the implications for U.S. governance and global leadership. The shutdown became a stark symbol of deep political division and institutional gridlock. In France, authorities implemented major security changes at the Louvre and other cultural institutions following the October heist. New surveillance systems, stricter access controls, and increased security personnel were introduced. Similar reviews took place across Europe, as governments reassessed how to protect cultural heritage in an era of evolving security threats. The incident continued to shape public debate about safety, funding, and the protection of shared global history. Between Ukraine and Russia, the war continued into another year. Despite diplomatic efforts and international mediation, fighting persisted along multiple fronts. Civilians endured ongoing hardship, while global attention increasingly focused on long-term support, reconstruction planning, and the broader consequences for European security. The conflict remained a defining factor in international relations, sanctions policy, and military planning worldwide. Globally, new climate reports confirmed 2025 as one of the most extreme years on record. Rising temperatures, widespread droughts, floods, and severe storms had affected millions. Scientists and international organizations warned that without accelerated action, future years could bring even greater disruption. Climate risks dominated end-of-year policy discussions, reinforcing the connection between environmental stability, economic security, and political governance. Economic uncertainty remained widespread. Markets closed the year facing unresolved trade tensions, uneven growth, and persistent inflation in several regions. Developing countries, in particular, struggled with debt burdens and recovery costs linked to climate disasters and conflict. International financial institutions called for coordinated global responses, warning that fragmented action could deepen inequality and instability. In the Middle East, fragile ceasefires remained under strain, while humanitarian needs continued to grow. Aid organizations urged sustained international engagement as the region faced the combined pressures of conflict, displacement, and economic hardship. As 2025 came to an end, leaders around the world looked ahead to an uncertain 2026. The events of the past year, political transitions, wars, protests, climate disasters, and economic strain, left lasting consequences. Trust in institutions had been tested, global cooperation remained fragile, and public demands for accountability continued to grow. December 2025 did not offer resolution, but it did provide clarity. The year had reshaped global politics in lasting ways, revealing both the vulnerabilities and resilience of societies worldwide. As the calendar turned, the world entered 2026 carrying the weight of unresolved challenges and the question of how, or whether, they would finally be addressed.